7,000 years before Christ, the world was warming. The great ice sheets that had locked much of the planet in frozen silence were retreating northward, leaving behind vast river valleys carved by millennia of glacial melt. In what would one day be called the Indian subcontinent, two mighty rivers, the great waterway itself and the Sarasvati, carved through alluvial plains so fertile, they would nurture one of humanity's first great experiments in urban living. The transformation began not with grand cities or monumental architecture, but in a small settlement called Mehrgarh, nestled in the Balochistan hills of modern-day Pakistan. Here, around 7 millennia ago, nomadic hunters made a decision that would echo through history. They stopped wandering and started planting. The earliest inhabitants lived in simple mud brick structures, rectangular rooms clustered together with shared walls, an innovation that spoke of cooperation rather than isolation. They domesticated wheat and barley, species that had migrated from the Fertile Crescent, but they also cultivated something entirely new, cotton. No other civilization would master cotton production for another 1,000 years. Their animal husbandry revealed similar innovation. Cattle, water buffalo, goats, and sheep grazed in managed herds. But these people also domesticated the zebu, the distinctive humped cattle that would become sacred symbols in later valley seals. These weren't mere livestock, they were partners in an agricultural revolution that would support millions. The sophistication of this society emerged most clearly in their treatment of the dead and the sick. Burials contained elaborate grave goods, turquoise beads from Central Asia, shells from the Arabian Sea, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers already connected this small farming community to distant lands, revealing organizational capabilities that transformed our understanding of Neolithic societies. More remarkable still was their medical knowledge. The settlement's dentists, for that is what they were, practiced therapeutic drilling of human teeth. 9 skulls from the period show perfectly round holes drilled into molars with flint-tipped copper bits, the world's first known dental surgery. The precision of these procedures and the fact that patients survived long enough for bone to heal around the drill holes demonstrated sophisticated understanding of pain management and antiseptic techniques. Pottery from the site tells the story of technological evolution compressed into millennia. Early vessels were crude, hand-formed containers fired in simple kilns. But 15 centuries later, local potters were creating elaborate decorated ceramics with geometric patterns that would persist in the region for thousands of years. The potter's wheel appeared around 3 millennia after the first settlements, revolutionizing production and creating the first standardized vessels, a precursor to the obsessive standardization that would define later valley culture. Social stratification emerged gradually. Early burials showed little difference in grave goods, but after 2.5 millennia, some individuals were interred with significantly more elaborate possessions: copper axes, decorative ceramics, rare stone beads. A hierarchy was crystallizing, though one notably different from contemporary Mesopotamian societies. No single individual dominated. Instead, wealth distributed among several elite families, creating a more collective form of leadership. The genetic foundation of this civilization came from multiple sources. The population descended primarily from Iranian farmers who had migrated eastward during the warming period, mixing with indigenous hunter-gatherer populations already present in the subcontinent. This genetic blend became the foundation for the valley peoples, though significant additional mixing with Central Asian populations would occur during the later Bronze Age, Climate played the crucial role in enabling this agricultural revolution. The post-glacial warming period, known as the Holocene climatic optimum, brought increased monsoon rains to the subcontinent between the 7th and 5th millennia before Christ. Rivers ran fuller, groundwater tables rose, and the arid landscapes of Balochistan and Sindh became verdant grasslands capable of supporting large agricultural populations. The Sarasvati river system, fed by glacial melt from the Himalayas, was during this period larger than the modern Ganges and the Great Western River combined. Space imagery has revealed its ancient course, a mighty waterway flowing from the mountains through Haryana and Rajasthan before emptying into the Arabian Sea near modern Gujarat. This river, which would later disappear entirely, was the lifeline that would enable the valley civilization's greatest cities to flourish. 4 millennia before Christ, dozens of settlements dotted the river valleys of the greater region. Each maintained the basic template established at the original site: mud brick architecture, mixed agriculture, craft specialization, but began developing distinctive regional characteristics. Sites like Nausharo and Pyrak showed increasingly sophisticated urban planning, with streets laid out in deliberate patterns and specialized quarters for different crafts. The pottery of this period reveals the first hints of the cultural uniformity that would later define the valley civilization. Ceramic styles began converging across the region, suggesting regular contact and perhaps shared cultural values that transcended local tribal identities. Decorative motifs, the pipal tree, humped bulls, geometric patterns, appeared repeatedly at sites hundreds of kilometers apart. Technological innovation accelerated. Copper working, initially limited to simple tools and ornaments, evolved into bronze production by the middle of the 4th millennium. Furnaces capable of reaching temperatures over 1,000 degrees Celsius appeared at multiple sites. Craft specialists began producing standardized tools, weapons, and ornaments that showed remarkable consistency in design and quality across the region. Trade networks expanded exponentially. The original settlement had traded with Central Asia and the Arabian Peninsula, but by 35 centuries before Christ, goods from the river region appeared in Mesopotamian archaeological contexts. Carnelian beads, almost certainly of local origin, have been found in Sumerian graves dating to 32 centuries before Christ. The valley people weren't just recipients of foreign trade. They were active participants in the world's first global economy. The social implications of this trade were profound. Wealth accumulation accelerated, but in patterns that distinguished valley society from its contemporaries. While Mesopotamian cities were developing palace complexes and monumental temples that glorified individual rulers, local settlements showed more distributed wealth and collective investment in infrastructure. Public buildings appeared. Large granaries, ceremonial platforms, sophisticated drainage systems, but no palaces or royal tombs. Writing may have emerged during this period, though the truth remains elusive. Symbols carved on pottery shards from late pre-urban sites show systematic repetition and increasing complexity. These may represent the earliest stages of the valley script, or they could be simply potter's marks or clan symbols. The question matters because it touches on one of the most intriguing aspects of later civilization: how they organized a society of millions with what may not have been writing as we understand it. 33 centuries before Christ, the stage was set for urban revolution. Populations had grown large enough to support specialized crafts and complex trade networks. Technological innovation had provided the tools for monumental construction. Social organization had evolved systems of collective decision-making and resource distribution. Climate conditions remained optimal, with strong monsoons feeding the great river systems. Most importantly, a shared cultural identity had emerged across the greater region. People separated by hundreds of kilometers shared similar pottery styles, architectural preferences, burial customs, and decorative motifs. They had developed what we might call a cultural horizon, a set of shared practices and beliefs that transcended local differences. The transition from this late pre-urban phase to the full valley civilization would happen with remarkable speed. Within 3 centuries, the scattered farming settlements would transform into humanity's most extensive urban civilization, covering an area larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. The foundations laid 7 millennia earlier would support cities that housed hundreds of thousands of people in unprecedented comfort and sophistication. But first, there would be one more crucial transitional phase, the early urban period, when the first true cities would rise from the fertile plains, carrying forward the innovations of the original settlement, while developing the distinctive characteristics that would make this civilization unique among the ancient world's great urban experiments. The first walls rose from the plains around 33 centuries before Christ. Not the gentle boundaries that had separated fields and courtyards in earlier farming communities, but massive fortifications of baked brick and stone that announced a new reality. Some places were now worth defending. Kot Diji, perched on a limestone ridge above the great river, became the archetype of this new experiment. Its builders constructed a citadel 20 meters high, surrounded by walls so thick that later generations would mistake them for natural hills. Within these defenses lived craftsmen, traders, and administrators who controlled the flow of goods along the river routes. The age of cities had begun. Similar fortified centers sprouted across the river plains during this revolutionary time. Kalibangan, built on the banks of the now vanished Sarasvati, featured elaborate fire altars and grid-patterned streets that would become the signature of regional planning. Amri, positioned strategically near the mouth of the Great Waterway, controlled maritime trade routes that connected the growing culture to distant shores. Harappa itself, destined to give its name to the entire society, began as one of these early fortified towns, its first walls laid over the ruins of older farming villages. But the most crucial development of this age was something we now call the Hakra ware culture, a bridge between the scattered farming communities and the unified society that would follow. Named after pottery styles found along the dried course of the Sarasvati, this culture represents the moment when regional variations began merging into something larger and more cohesive. The Hakra ware people perfected technologies that would define the coming empire. They standardized brick sizes across hundreds of kilometers, an innovation that required not just technical knowledge but unprecedented coordination between distant communities. Their potters developed the fast wheel, enabling mass production of identical vessels. Metalworkers mastered bronze casting, creating tools and weapons of remarkable uniformity. Most significantly, they began writing. The earliest symbols that would evolve into the regional script appeared during these centuries, carved into seals and stamped onto pottery. Unlike the complex hieroglyphic and cuneiform systems developing in Egypt and Mesopotamia, these symbols were elegant and geometric. Fish, trees, human figures, and abstract patterns that conveyed meaning through visual metaphor rather than phonetic representation. Trade transformed from occasional exchange to systematic commerce. Workshops in different towns specialized in particular goods. Chanhudaro became famous for bead making. Shortugai controlled lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Coastal sites like Balakot processed shells into ornaments and tools. This specialization created interdependence. No single community could survive in isolation. The pottery of these centuries tells the story of cultural convergence. Early in the era, each region maintained distinctive ceramic traditions inherited from their farming ancestors. But as trade networks strengthened and populations mixed, styles began harmonizing. By 28 centuries before Christ, pottery from the northern mountains to the southern coast shared common decorative motifs, intersecting circles, fish scale patterns, pipal leaves, and stylized animals. Technological innovation accelerated beyond simple craft improvement. Engineers developed kiln designs capable of firing bricks to temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Celsius, creating ceramics harder than stone. Metallurgists learned to alloy copper with tin and arsenic, producing bronze tools that held sharper edges than pure copper implements. Most remarkably, they began standardizing measurements, weights, lengths, and volumes that remained consistent across the entire region. The social implications of this standardization were profound. Creating identical bricks required not just technical knowledge, but social coordination. Every potter had to use the same ratios. Every metalworker had to follow identical specifications. Every builder had to conform to shared architectural principles. This suggests a level of cultural integration unprecedented in human history. Maritime connections expanded dramatically during these centuries. Regional sailors didn't simply trade along familiar coastal routes. They ventured into the open waters of the Arabian Sea, establishing trading posts in Oman and Bahrain. At sites like Ras al-Jins in Oman and Kalat al-Bahrain, local-style pottery and seals appear alongside native artifacts, indicating permanent trading communities rather than occasional visits. The scale of this maritime enterprise becomes clear in Mesopotamian archives from these times. Sumerian tablets from Ur and Babylon reference a land called Meluha, almost certainly the river culture, as a source of precious materials: carnelian, ivory, pearls, exotic woods, and mysterious black stones that may have been magnetite. The quantities mentioned suggest regular, large-scale shipments rather than occasional luxury trades. Land routes proved equally important. Caravans carried regional goods through the mountain passes of Afghanistan and Iran, bringing back lapis lazuli, silver, and turquoise. At Shortugai, near the lapis mines of Badakhshan, colonists established what may have been the world's first mining colony, a community that maintained local architectural styles and pottery traditions while extracting precious stones for the homeland. The emergence of craft specialization created new social classes. Bead makers, metal workers, seal carvers, and pottery painters developed distinctive techniques passed down through family workshops. Some crafts required such skill that practitioners may have traveled between towns, spreading techniques and maintaining quality standards across the culture. Religious practices began showing the uniformity that would characterize mature society. Fire altars, built to standardized dimensions and orientations, appeared at sites across the region. The motifs that decorated pottery and seals, sacred trees, humped bulls, meditating figures, repeated with remarkable consistency, suggesting shared mythologies and ritual practices. The bull became particularly significant during these centuries. Unlike the wild aurochs depicted in earlier art, these were clearly domesticated zebu cattle with distinctive humps and gentle expressions. They appeared on seals in standardized poses, standing before sacred trees, being fed by human figures or arranged in processions. The reverence for cattle that would characterize later religion was crystallizing. City planning evolved from practical necessity to aesthetic principle. Early fortified sites had grown organically around defensive cores, but later communities showed deliberate design. Streets aligned with cardinal directions, residential areas separated from craft quarters, and public buildings occupied prominent positions. The grid pattern layout that would define mature cities was taking shape. Water management became increasingly sophisticated. The seasonal nature of monsoon rains and the importance of river transport made water control crucial for survival. Engineers developed elaborate drainage systems, wells with perfectly round shafts, and reservoirs lined with watertight brick. At Dolavira, builders created a complex of 16 water tanks that could store enough fresh water to sustain the population through extended dry seasons. The development of weights and measures reveals the mathematical sophistication of this culture. Bronze weights discovered from these times follow a binary system: 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and 64 units, with a basic unit of approximately 13.7 grams. More remarkably, this same system appears at sites across the entire region, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the coast of Gujarat, an achievement in standardization that would not be matched again until the modern era. Script development accelerated during the later centuries of this age. What began as simple pictographs evolved into a complex system of over 400 distinct symbols. Unlike contemporary writing systems that represented sounds, the regional script appeared to function more like modern mathematical notation, symbols that conveyed meaning directly without necessarily representing spoken language. This may explain why the script has proven so difficult to decipher. It wasn't phonetic writing as we understand it. The transition from fortified communities to open cities marked the era's end. Defensive walls, so prominent in early sites like Kotdiji, became less common in later towns. This suggests either that warfare ceased to be a major concern, or that the culture had developed other means of conflict resolution. The absence of weapons in later archaeological contexts supports the former interpretation. Population growth during these centuries was dramatic. Early fortified sites housed perhaps a few thousand inhabitants each, but by the era's end, communities like premature Harappa may have supported 20,000 or more residents. This growth occurred not through conquest or forced migration, but through natural increase and voluntary aggregation. People chose to live in these growing centers. The economic foundation for this population growth came from agricultural intensification. Farmers developed new crop varieties, including a drought-resistant wheat that could grow in marginal lands. They domesticated new animals, particularly the water buffalo, which provided both labor and protein. Irrigation systems allowed cultivation of previously unusable areas, supporting larger populations on the same land base. Regional variations persisted within this growing uniformity. Northern communities maintained stronger connections to Central Asian trade routes, while southern sites developed more sophisticated maritime technologies. Mountain centers specialized in mineral extraction, while river plains focused on agriculture and manufacturing. This diversity within unity would become a hallmark of the mature culture. The era ended not with conquest or collapse, but with transformation. The fortified communities of the early phase evolved into the open cities of the mature stage. Defensive walls gave way to sophisticated planning. Regional pottery styles merged into empire-wide standards. Local scripts converged into a unified writing system. 7 centuries of gradual change culminated in the emergence of true metropolitan life around 26 centuries before Christ. The experimental phase was over. The scattered fortified towns had coalesced into something unprecedented. A peaceful, standardized, economically integrated society spanning over 1 million square kilometers. The stage was set for the mature phase, an era when the innovations of the pre-metropolitan age would reach their full flowering, in cities that would astonish the world with their sophistication, standardization, and mysterious absence of kings, palaces, and monuments to individual power. The river people had created something entirely new in human experience, a society organized around collective prosperity rather than individual dominance. 26 centuries before Christ, the experimental phase ended. Across the river plains, defensive walls came down, and true cities rose in their place. What emerged would challenge every assumption about how ancient societies organized themselves, how power operated, and what human beings could accomplish when they chose cooperation over conquest. Harappa, the namesake city, sprawled across 150 hectares of prime agricultural land beside the Ravi River. Its builders had torn down the old fortifications and erected something unprecedented. A metropolis without a palace, without royal tombs, without monuments to individual rulers. Instead, they built for everyone. Wide boulevards ran straight as arrows from north to south, intersected by smaller streets in perfect grid patterns. Every neighborhood had access to public wells, every house connected to an elaborate sewage system that would not be matched in sophistication until the Roman Empire. But Harappa was just the beginning. Mohenjo-daro, rising from the floodplains of the great river itself, dwarfed even this impressive city. Here, the same obsessive planning reached its pinnacle. The Great Bath, a rectangular pool lined with perfectly fitted bricks and sealed with natural tar, dominated the citadel area. Surrounding it were structures whose function remains mysterious. Large halls with no obvious purpose, granaries designed to store vast quantities of grain, and residential complexes that housed hundreds of families in identical, comfortable apartments. Dolavira, in the harsh landscape of Kutch, demonstrated the culture's mastery over hostile environments. Its engineers carved reservoirs directly into rock, creating a water management system so sophisticated it could sustain 20,000 inhabitants in one of the subcontinent's most arid regions. Massive stone walls enclosed the city, not for defense, but to create distinct districts. An upper citadel for ceremonies, a middle town for residents, and a lower city for craftsmen and workers. Rakhigarhi, recently revealed as perhaps the largest of all these cities, covered over 350 hectares, larger than many modern metropolitan centers. Its ruins stretch for kilometers across the dried floodplains of the ancient Sarasvati, testament to a population that may have exceeded 100,000 souls. The scale defies comprehension. Entire neighborhoods of identical houses, workshop districts producing goods for export across continents, and drainage systems that managed water for populations larger than most medieval European cities. These were not isolated urban experiments. Across the plains, over 1,500 sites shared the same architectural DNA. From the mountains of Afghanistan to the shores of Gujarat, from the foothills of the Himalayas to the Arabian sea coast, the same urban planning principles repeated with mechanical precision. Streets aligned with cardinal directions, houses built to standardized dimensions, public wells spaced at regular intervals, drainage systems engineered to identical specifications. The uniformity extended to the smallest details. Bricks measured exactly 4 to 2 to 1 in ratio, length to width to height, whether fired in Harappa or Dolavira. Potter's wheels turned at identical speeds. producing vessels so similar that sherds from different cities are often indistinguishable. Even the bronze scales used by merchants followed the same binary weight system across thousands of kilometers. This standardization represents something unprecedented in human history. A civilization organized around collective agreement rather than individual command. No pharaoh decreed these standards. No emperor enforced these measurements. Yet somehow, millions of people across vast distances voluntarily adopted identical practices, suggesting a level of cultural integration that modern nations struggle to achieve. The absence of palaces becomes more remarkable when compared to contemporary cultures. While Egyptian pharaohs built pyramids and Mesopotamian kings erected ziggurats, these river cities invested their collective wealth in infrastructure that served everyone. Public buildings dominated city centers, but they were baths, granaries, and assembly halls, structures that enhanced community life rather than glorifying individual rulers. Archaeological evidence reveals no royal burials, no warrior graves, no hoards of weapons or precious metals accumulated by elite families. Instead, wealth distributed relatively evenly throughout society. Houses varied in size, but the largest were only 3 or 4 times bigger than the smallest. A far cry from the vast palaces that towered over hovels in other ancient societies. This egalitarian distribution of resources enabled population densities that rivaled modern cities. Mohenjo-Daro housed an estimated 35,000 residents within its walls, while Harappa supported perhaps 25,000. Smaller centers like Chandhu-Daro and Kalibangan each sustained populations of 5,000 to 10,000. The total population across all sites may have reached 4 to 5 million people, a concentration of humanity unprecedented in the ancient world. Managing these populations required organizational capabilities that stretch our understanding of pre-literate societies. Water had to be distributed fairly, waste removed efficiently, food supplied consistently, and trade goods produced to exact specifications. Yet no evidence exists for the bureaucratic machinery that handled such tasks in Egypt or Mesopotamia. No scribal schools, no palace archives, no tax collection records. The society functioned, but through mechanisms that remain invisible to archaeological investigation. The maritime empire that sustained this civilization reached across the Arabian Sea to the Persian Gulf and beyond. At Lothal, engineers constructed a tidal dock that could accommodate ships displacing 30 tons or more. The precision of this construction, accounting for tidal variations, seasonal flooding, and the settling of heavy vessels, demonstrates engineering sophistication that rivals modern harbor design. Trade goods flowed through this network in quantities that suggest industrial-scale production. Carnelian beads manufactured in Gujarat workshops appeared in Mesopotamian graves by the thousands. Ivory carved in river cities decorated palaces in Babylon. Conch shells processed in coastal workshops became drinking vessels in Central Asian oases. The volume of trade implies not occasional merchant expeditions, but regular commercial shipping that connected the river civilization to markets from Afghanistan to Oman. The production methods that enabled this trade represent another technological revolution. Craftsmen didn't simply make individual items to order. They mass-produced standardized goods designed for export markets. Bead-making workshops in Chandhu-Daro contained hundreds of identical drills, each calibrated to create beads of specific dimensions. Potter's wheels in different cities produced vessels so uniform they could be stacked and shipped efficiently across continents. Quality control reached obsessive levels. Pottery that failed to meet standards was marked with rejection symbols and discarded. Bronze tools that didn't match specifications were melted down and recast. Even finished goods bore maker's marks that allowed defective items to be traced back to specific workshops, a level of accountability that modern manufacturers would recognize. This emphasis on standardization extended to the civilization's most mysterious achievement, a writing system that may not have been writing at all. Over 4,000 inscribed objects have been discovered: seals, pottery, bronze tablets, and ivory sticks covered with symbols that repeat in complex patterns. Unlike contemporary scripts from Egypt and Mesopotamia, these symbols show no clear phonetic structure. They may instead represent a sophisticated notation system, symbols that conveyed meaning directly without representing spoken sounds. Recent computer analysis has revealed that the script follows mathematical patterns consistent with other communication systems, but its structure remains unlike any known writing. Some symbols appear only at the beginning of inscriptions, others only at the end. Certain combinations repeat across thousands of seals, while other sequences appear just once. The symbols may have functioned more like modern corporate logos or mathematical notation, conveying specific information to those who understood the system without necessarily representing language as we conceive it. If the script wasn't phonetic writing, it raises profound questions about how the civilization organized itself. How did administrators coordinate activities across millions of people without written records? How did merchants negotiate contracts without written agreements? How did engineers share technical specifications without written plans? The answers may lie in organizational methods we haven't yet recognized. Systems of oral tradition, visual communication, and practical training that functioned more efficiently than bureaucratic writing. Religious practices reflected the same collective emphasis found in civic organization. Instead of massive temples dedicated to individual deities, the river cities contained numerous smaller shrines, fire altars, and ritual bathing areas distributed throughout residential neighborhoods. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro may have served ceremonial purposes, but it was accessible to the entire community rather than restricted to priestly elites. The iconography that decorated seals and pottery emphasized fertility, abundance, and harmony with nature. The famous Proto-Shiva seal shows a seated figure surrounded by animals, not dominating them, but existing in peaceful coexistence. Trees appear frequently, often with figures tending or worshipping them. Bulls and water buffalo are depicted as gentle, well-fed creatures, rather than symbols of power or aggression. Female figurines found throughout the cities suggest reverence for maternal and creative forces. These aren't goddess statues in the traditional sense. No temples have been found dedicated to them. No elaborate rituals appear to have surrounded them. Instead, they seem to represent a more personal, household-level spirituality that emphasized life-giving and nurturing aspects of existence. The absence of weapons in archaeological context becomes more significant when viewed alongside this peaceful iconography. While Mesopotamian and Egyptian art celebrated military conquest and royal power, River Valley art focused on prosperity, fertility, and harmonious community life. The few human figures depicted in art show people engaged in ritual activities, craft production, or peaceful interaction with animals. This peaceful emphasis extended to inter-community relations. Despite controlling territory larger than modern Pakistan, the civilization shows no evidence of internal warfare. No fortified borders divided regions. No burned cities mark conquest events. No mass graves suggest battle casualties. For 7 centuries, millions of people across this vast area lived without apparent military conflict, an achievement unmatched in recorded history. The economic foundation for this peaceful prosperity rested on agricultural abundance made possible by sophisticated water management. Engineers diverted river courses, constructed canals, and built reservoirs that stored monsoon rainfall for use during dry seasons. At Dolavira, the water storage capacity exceeded the city's annual consumption by a factor of 3, insurance against drought that enabled stable population growth. Crop diversification reduced dependence on single food sources. Farmers cultivated wheat, barley, field peas, sesame, dates, and melons in carefully managed rotation systems. They domesticated water buffalo for heavy agricultural work and zebu cattle for milk and ritual purposes. Chickens provided eggs and meat, while sheep and goats supplied wool and leather. The civilization's approach to urban planning prioritized public health in ways that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. Every house had access to a private well or public water source. Wastewater flowed through covered drains that prevented contamination and disease transmission. Refuse collection systems removed organic waste from residential areas. The result was urban populations that could grow to unprecedented sizes without succumbing to the epidemics that periodically devastated other ancient cities. Building techniques evolved to accommodate both monsoon floods and earthquake activity. Foundations extended deep into alluvial soil to provide stability during tremors. Drainage systems included overflow channels that managed seasonal flooding without damaging structures. Houses were built with emergency exits and storage areas that could sustain families during natural disasters. The civilization's relationship with its environment reflected long-term thinking rarely seen in ancient societies. Rather than exhausting resources for short-term gain, communities managed forests, fisheries, and agricultural land for sustained productivity. Archaeological evidence shows no signs of deforestation, soil depletion, or overhunting. The environmental degradation that contributed to the collapse of other ancient civilizations. This sustainable approach extended to population management. Unlike societies that expanded through conquest and exploitation, the river communities grew through voluntary aggregation and natural increase. People chose to live in these cities because they offered security, prosperity, and comfort unavailable elsewhere. The civilization's expansion was peaceful, a model of development that attracted rather than coerced participation. The technological achievements that made this lifestyle possible required knowledge systems that rivaled anything produced in the ancient world. Metallurgists created alloys with properties optimized for specific uses. Engineers designed water systems that functioned automatically without constant maintenance. Architects developed construction techniques that produced buildings lasting millennia. Most remarkably, this knowledge spread without apparent centralized education systems. No schools have been discovered, no libraries, no archives where technical information was stored and transmitted. Yet somehow, craftsmen in distant cities learned identical techniques, maintained identical standards, and innovated within shared parameters. The mechanism for this knowledge transmission remains one of the civilization's greatest mysteries. The peak of this achievement occurred roughly between 2,500 and 2,200 years before Christ, when the civilization reached its maximum geographic extent and population density. During these 3 centuries, the standardization, prosperity, and peaceful cooperation that characterized the culture reached levels that wouldn't be matched again until the modern era. But even at its zenith, subtle signs of future challenges were emerging. Climate records indicate that monsoon patterns were beginning to shift. River courses were starting to change. The environmental stability that had supported unprecedented urban growth for 5 centuries was entering a period of uncertainty that would ultimately test whether this remarkable experiment in peaceful civilization could adapt to changing conditions. The mature phase represented humanity's first successful experiment in large-scale urban cooperation. For 7 centuries, millions of people across vast distances voluntarily participated in a shared culture that prioritized collective welfare over individual aggrandizement. They created cities without kings, prosperity without conquest, and peace without oppression. Achievements that modern societies continue to struggle to replicate. What made this experiment possible, and why it ultimately proved vulnerable to environmental change, would determine not only the fate of this remarkable civilization, but also the lessons it offers for understanding the possibilities and limitations of human social organization. The morning ritual began before dawn. In houses across the river plains, from the mountain foothills to the coastal marshes, families rose to the same routine that had governed daily life for centuries. The sound of water flowing through household drains mixed with the grinding of grain, the lowing of cattle, and the steady rhythm of potters' wheels already spinning in workshop courtyards. Every home, regardless of size or location, contained the same essential elements. A private well provided fresh water, drawn from carefully maintained aquifers. A bathroom with a sloped floor channeled waste into covered drains that carried sewage away from living areas. Storage rooms held grain in large ceramic jars, their mouths sealed with clay to prevent spoilage. Courtyards provided space for cooking, craft work, and the keeping of small animals. The houses themselves reflected both standardization and subtle social distinctions. The smallest contained 4 or 5 rooms arranged around a central courtyard, sufficient for a nuclear family and perhaps an elderly parent or unmarried sibling. Larger residences might sprawl across 12 or 15 rooms, with separate quarters for extended family members, workshop spaces for family crafts, and storage areas for trade goods. But even the grandest houses differed from their neighbors only in scale, not in luxury. No residence contained throne rooms or treasure chambers. No family accumulated golden ornaments or precious weapons. Wealth expressed itself through the quality of construction, better fitted bricks, more sophisticated drainage, larger storage capacity, rather than ostentatious display. The construction techniques that created these homes required skills passed down through generations of builders. Foundations extended deep into alluvial soil, anchored with wooden posts that provided stability during earthquakes and floods. Walls rose in carefully bonded courses, each brick positioned to distribute weight evenly and resist lateral stress. Flat roofs, accessible by internal staircases, provided additional living space during pleasant weather and storage areas during monsoons. Water management within each household represented a marvel of engineering forethought. Private wells reached depths of 15 to 20 meters, tapping aquifers that remained pure through careful separation from waste systems. Bathrooms featured sophisticated drainage that prevented contamination while conserving water for reuse in gardens and craft activities. Overflow systems protected against flooding during heavy monsoons while ensuring adequate water pressure for daily use. The daily diet reflected both agricultural abundance and careful nutritional planning. Breakfast typically consisted of flat bread made from wheat or barley, accompanied by dates, yogurt, and perhaps honey gathered from wild hives. Fish caught in the rivers and coastal waters provided protein several times weekly. Vegetables, onions, garlic, peas, sesame added variety and essential nutrients to grain-based meals. Cooking techniques evolved around the seasonal availability of different foods and fuels. Clay ovens, built into household courtyards, could bake bread and roast meat using minimal wood or dried dung. Large storage jars kept grain fresh through the dry season, while smaller vessels held oils, spices, and fermented foods that added flavor and preserved nutrients during long sea voyages or overland trading expeditions. Children's lives combined education with entertainment in ways that prepared them for adult responsibilities while preserving their sense of play. Toys discovered in residential areas include clay animals with movable heads, miniature carts with working wheels, and whistles shaped like birds that could produce multiple musical tones. Board games with elaborate rules taught strategic thinking, while dice and gaming pieces made from precious materials suggest that adults participated in these activities alongside their children. The transition from childhood to adult work roles happened gradually through apprenticeship systems that preserved specialized knowledge while allowing for innovation. Young potters learned to center clay on wheels spinning at precise speeds, achieving uniformity that enabled mass production of identical vessels. Metalworkers mastered temperature control that could alloy copper with tin in exact proportions, creating bronze tools harder than stone, yet flexible enough to reshape when necessary. Beadmaking represented perhaps the most sophisticated craft tradition, requiring skills that took decades to master fully. Craftsmen learned to heat carnelian to temperatures that changed its color from pale yellow to deep red, then to drill holes using diamond-tipped tools that could create perfectly round apertures less than a millimeter in diameter. The finished beads were so uniform that modern archaeologists sometimes mistake them for machine-made products. The standardization that characterized these crafts extended beyond simple quality control to encompass aesthetic principles that unified artistic expression across vast distances. Pottery painters in different cities used identical motifs, intersecting circles, fish scales, pipal leaves, applied with techniques that produced vessels indistinguishable in style, despite being manufactured hundreds of kilometers apart. Textile production achieved similar levels of sophistication and uniformity. Cotton cultivation, spinning, and weaving techniques created fabrics so fine that impressions preserved on metal objects reveal thread counts approaching modern standards. Dyes extracted from plants and minerals produced colors that remained vivid for millennia, suggesting chemical knowledge that could stabilize organic pigments against fading and decay. The tools used in these crafts demonstrate both technological innovation and remarkable durability. Bronze implements discovered in workshop contexts retain sharp edges after 4,000 years. Measuring devices show wear patterns indicating decades of regular use while maintaining accuracy to fractions of modern metric units. Stone mortars used for grinding pigments and spices bear polished surfaces that testify to generations of daily use. Transportation networks that connected these workshops to distant markets required engineering solutions adapted to diverse geographic challenges. In mountainous regions, roads carved into cliff faces enabled pack animals to carry goods through passes that remained navigable year-round. River transport utilized vessels designed with shallow drafts that could navigate seasonal variations in water levels while carrying heavy cargoes of grain, pottery, and metal goods. The wheeled vehicles that moved goods overland represented sophisticated adaptations to local conditions. Carts used in river plains featured large wheels that distributed weight across soft alluvial soils, preventing them from becoming mired during monsoon seasons. Mountain vehicles used smaller, more maneuverable wheels that could navigate narrow paths while maintaining stability on steep grades. Maritime technology reached levels that enabled regular voyages across hundreds of kilometers of open ocean. Ships built in coastal shipyards could carry 30 tons of cargo while maintaining seaworthiness in rough weather. Navigation techniques allowed sailors to maintain course during multi-day voyages, reaching distant ports with accuracy that suggests sophisticated understanding of winds, currents, and celestial navigation. The dockyard at Lothal demonstrates the precision with which these maritime operations were planned and executed. Engineers calculated tidal ranges, seasonal flooding patterns, and the loading requirements of different vessel types to create a harbour that could accommodate the largest ships while protecting them from storm damage. The basin could be sealed during low tide to maintain adequate water depth, then opened to allow ships to enter and depart with favourable currents. Medical knowledge, applied to both human health and veterinary care, reached standards that wouldn't be matched again for millennia. Surgical instruments discovered in residential contexts include scalpels, forceps, and probes designed for specific procedures. Dental work went far beyond the therapeutic drilling practiced at early sites to include cosmetic modifications and the treatment of complex oral diseases. The care of domestic animals reflected similar medical sophistication. Cattle, water buffalo, sheep, and goats received treatments for injuries and diseases that maintained their health and productivity throughout long working lives. Veterinary knowledge extended to the breeding of animals with specific characteristics. Zebu cattle selected for docility and milk production, water buffalo bred for strength and endurance in heavy agricultural work. Women's roles in this society appear to have been more diverse and influential than in most contemporary cultures. Female figurines show women engaged in various activities, craft production, religious ceremonies, and what may be administrative or teaching roles. Burial practices suggest relatively equal treatment of male and female remains, with both sexes receiving similar grave goods and burial orientations. The evidence for women's participation in economic activities comes from workshop contexts where female figurines appear alongside craft tools, suggesting that women may have controlled certain types of production. Seal ownership also appears to have been relatively gender-neutral, with similar proportions of male and female figures appearing on seals that may have indicated property ownership or professional identity. Marriage and family organization seem to have emphasized extended kinship networks rather than nuclear family isolation. Large houses often contained multiple cooking areas and private spaces that could accommodate several related families while maintaining individual privacy. Shared storage and workshop areas suggest cooperative economic activities between related households. The treatment of elderly family members reflected cultural values that prioritized care for non-productive community members. Archaeological evidence shows that individuals who survived beyond normal working age continued to receive adequate nutrition and medical care, suggesting social systems that supported aging populations rather than abandoning them when they could no longer contribute economically. Religious practices integrated seamlessly with daily life, rather than requiring separate sacred spaces or specialized priestly classes. Household shrines contained small figurines, offering vessels, and symbolic objects that suggest regular family-based rituals. Fire altars built to standardized dimensions appeared in residential courtyards, indicating that religious observances were conducted at the family level rather than in large public ceremonies. The iconography that decorated these household religious objects emphasized themes of fertility, prosperity, and harmony with natural forces. Tree worship appears to have been central to spiritual practice, with sacred groves perhaps serving as community gathering places for larger ceremonies that brought together multiple families or neighborhoods. Animal symbolism in religious art focused on domestic species rather than wild or predatory creatures. Bulls and water buffalo appear as gentle, well cared for animals, associated with abundance and prosperity. Dogs, shown in affectionate interaction with human figures, may have held special spiritual significance related to loyalty and protection of household welfare. The absence of monumental religious architecture suggests spiritual practices that emphasized personal and community relationships with divine forces, rather than hierarchical priesthoods or elaborate temple rituals. Religious life appears to have been democratically accessible, with every family capable of conducting the ceremonies necessary for spiritual well-being. Music and artistic expression enriched daily life through instruments and decorative objects found in residential contexts. Whistles, drums, and stringed instruments suggest that musical performance was a regular part of community life. Dancing figures depicted on pottery and seals indicate that rhythmic movement accompanied musical activities, perhaps during religious ceremonies or seasonal celebrations. The integration of artistic elements into functional objects demonstrates aesthetic sensibilities that valued beauty as an essential component of daily life. Pottery used for cooking and storage featured decorative elements that served no practical purpose beyond visual pleasure. Tools and implements incorporated design elements that enhanced their appearance while maintaining functional efficiency. Personal ornamentation reflected both individual taste and adherence to cultural standards of appropriate dress and appearance. Bronze mirrors, cosmetic containers, and jewelry suggest that physical appearance was considered important for both social interaction and personal satisfaction. The uniformity of decorative styles across different regions indicates shared concepts of beauty and appropriate self-presentation. Burial practices provide the clearest evidence for beliefs about death and afterlife, though the evidence suggests relatively modest concepts of post-mortem existence. Graves contain useful objects, pottery, tools, ornaments, but not the elaborate wealth accumulations found in contemporary royal burials elsewhere. This suggests either beliefs in relatively egalitarian afterlife conditions or concepts of death that didn't require extensive material provisions. The positioning of burials within or near residential areas indicates that the dead remained connected to living communities rather than being segregated in distant cemeteries. Family ancestors may have continued to play roles in household spiritual life, with their graves serving as focal points for ongoing religious observances. Children's burials receive particularly careful treatment, with small bodies often interred in large ceramic jars that may have symbolized protective wombs for spiritual rebirth. The grave goods accompanying these burials include toys and miniature versions of adult tools, suggesting concepts of childhood that continued into whatever afterlife existence the culture envisioned. The seasonal rhythm that governed this daily life reflected careful adaptation to monsoon cycles and river flooding patterns. Agricultural activities, craft production, and long-distance trade all adjusted to climatic conditions that brought abundance during certain months and required careful resource management during others. Flood seasons brought both opportunities and challenges that required community-wide coordination. Water management systems had to be maintained and adjusted to handle increased flow, while protecting residential and workshop areas from damage. Agricultural planning required precise timing of planting and harvesting to take advantage of optimal moisture conditions while avoiding crop losses to excessive flooding. The dry season enabled different types of economic activities, particularly long-distance overland trade that could take advantage of predictable weather conditions and navigable river levels. Craft production intensified during these months when agricultural demands were reduced and raw materials could be processed into finished goods for export to distant markets. This seasonal adaptation created community rhythms that brought people together for collective activities, while allowing individual families to maintain their economic independence. The balance between cooperation and autonomy that characterized these seasonal cycles may have been central to the social stability that enabled the culture to flourish for so many centuries without apparent internal conflict. The daily life that emerged from this combination of technological sophistication, social cooperation, and environmental adaptation created living standards that wouldn't be matched again until the modern era. People lived in comfortable homes with running water and waste disposal, ate nutritious and varied diets, engaged in meaningful work that contributed to community prosperity, and participated in cultural activities that enriched their lives beyond mere survival needs. Most remarkably, they achieved these living standards without the oppressive hierarchies, military conflicts, and environmental destruction that characterized most other ancient civilizations. The daily life they created was sustainable, peaceful, and prosperous, a model of human social organization that modern societies continue to struggle to achieve. The first cracks appeared not in the walls of the great cities, but in the earth itself. Deep beneath the Himalayan foothills, tectonic forces that had remained stable for millennia began shifting with imperceptible but catastrophic precision. The Yamuna River, which had fed the mighty Sarasvati system for thousands of years, started carving a new path eastward toward the Ganges. What followed would be the death of a super river, and with it, the slow strangulation of humanity's first great experiment in peaceful urban civilization. The Sarasvati had been more than a river. It was the lifeline of an empire. From its glacial sources in the Himalayas, it had carried snowmelt and monsoon waters through the fertile plains of Haryana and Rajasthan, supporting more than 60% of all Harappan settlements. Its course, now visible only through satellite imagery and dried channels filled with wind-blown sand, reveals a waterway that dwarfed both the Indus and the Ganges. At its peak, the Sarasvati stretched over 1,600 kilometers from source to sea, with a drainage basin larger than modern France. The cities that had grown along its banks, Kalibangan, Banawali, Rakhigarhi, and hundreds of smaller settlements, had planned their entire existence around this river's seasonal rhythms. Their agricultural systems depended on its annual floods to rejuvenate soil and replenish groundwater. Their trade networks used its waters to transport goods from the mountains to the sea. Their populations had grown to sizes that could only be sustained by the agricultural abundance that the great river made possible. When the Yamuna began its eastward shift around 19 centuries before Christ, the effects rippled through the Sarasvati system like a slow-motion earthquake. Water levels dropped gradually at first, perhaps unnoticeably to individual generations who adapted to slightly lower flood levels and deeper wells. But the geological forces at work were relentless. As the Yamuna continued its migration toward the Ganges, it captured tributary after tributary that had once fed the Sarasvati, each loss reducing the great river's flow by measurable amounts. The Drisadvati River, a major tributary that had contributed substantial water volume, was among the first to be captured by the shifting drainage patterns. Its loss alone reduced the Sarasvati's flow by nearly 30%, forcing agricultural communities to adapt quickly to reduced water availability. Wells that had reliably produced water for generations began to fail. Irrigation channels that had carried water to distant fields ran dry during critical growing seasons. Climate change compounded the river's decline through shifts in monsoon patterns that reduced precipitation across the entire Himalayan watershed. Glacial retreat caused by the same warming trends that were transforming weather patterns across Eurasia, diminished the snowmelt that had provided the Sarasvati's dry season flow. Archaeological evidence from lake sediments and tree rings indicates that rainfall decreased by 20 to 30% during the critical centuries between 1900 and 1500 years before Christ. The human response to these environmental changes reveals both the sophistication and ultimate limitations of Harappan adaptive strategies. Engineering solutions that had worked successfully for centuries were expanded and refined as communities attempted to maintain their traditional lifestyles despite reduced water availability. At Dolavira, builders constructed additional reservoirs and deepened existing ones, increasing the city's water storage capacity by over 50%. Canal systems were extended and improved to capture every possible drop of seasonal rainfall. But engineering could not compensate indefinitely for the loss of a river system that had provided the foundation for an entire civilization. As water became scarce, competition increased between settlements that had previously cooperated in managing shared resources. Archaeological evidence suggests that some communities began restricting access to wells and reservoirs that had once been communally maintained. The social cooperation that had been fundamental to Harappan culture started fracturing under environmental stress. Population pressure intensified these conflicts as people from failing settlements migrated toward communities that still had adequate water supplies. Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, located on rivers that continued to flow, experienced sudden influxes of refugees from Sarasvati Basin settlements. These population movements strained infrastructure that had been designed for stable population levels, leading to overcrowding and deteriorating living conditions. The breakdown of standardization that had been the hallmark of mature Harappan culture became evident in pottery styles, architectural practices, and craft production. Regional variations that had been suppressed during the peak of the civilization began reasserting themselves as communities lost regular contact with distant settlements. Local pottery traditions diverged from the empire-wide styles that had prevailed for centuries. Building techniques adapted to locally available materials rather than maintaining uniform construction standards. Trade networks that had connected the Harappan world to markets from Afghanistan to Oman began contracting as reduced agricultural surpluses limited the goods available for export. Workshops that had produced carnelian beads, bronze tools, and textiles for international markets found their supply chains disrupted by the abandonment of settlements that had provided raw materials. The maritime empire that had extended Harappan influence across the Arabian Sea gradually retreated to a few coastal enclaves. At Lothal, the great dockyard that had accommodated ships from across the known world began silting up as reduced river flow failed to maintain the deep channels necessary for large vessel navigation. Archaeological layers from this period show hasty construction and poor quality repairs, suggesting that the city's inhabitants were struggling to maintain infrastructure without the resources that had supported their predecessors' achievements. The script that had unified administrative and commercial activities across the empire shows signs of deterioration during this period. Late inscriptions contain fewer symbols and simpler compositions than earlier examples, suggesting either that literacy was declining or that the complex information systems that had required elaborate notation were no longer functioning. Some scholars interpret this as evidence that the centralized systems that had coordinated empire-wide activities were breaking down. Agriculture, the foundation of Harappan prosperity, faced multiple simultaneous challenges that proved increasingly difficult to overcome. Soil salinization, caused by intensive irrigation in areas of reduced rainfall, rendered previously fertile fields unsuitable for cultivation. Deforestation, accelerated by the need for fuel and construction materials as communities attempted to adapt to changing conditions, led to erosion and further soil degradation. The careful crop rotation systems that had maintained soil fertility for centuries became harder to sustain when water shortages forced farmers to prioritize immediate food production over long-term agricultural sustainability. Archaeological evidence from granary sites shows that storage capacity decreased during this period, suggesting that communities were unable to maintain the surplus food stores that had provided security against seasonal variations and natural disasters. Animal husbandry faced similar pressures as reduced pasture lands and water availability forced communities to reduce their herds of cattle, water buffalo, sheep, and goats. The zebu cattle that had been central to both agricultural production and religious practice became less common in archaeological assemblages from this period. Wild animal populations, stressed by the same environmental changes affecting human communities, provided less reliable supplementary protein through hunting. Religious practices began showing signs of stress and transformation as communities struggled to maintain traditional ceremonies and observances. Fire altars, which had been constructed to standardize dimensions across the empire, show increasingly irregular proportions and construction techniques. The iconography that decorated pottery and seals began emphasizing themes of scarcity and survival, rather than the abundance and prosperity that had characterized earlier art. Female figurines from this period often show more elaborate dress and ornamentation, possibly indicating increased importance of fertility and prosperity symbols, as these qualities became harder to achieve in daily life. Tree worship, which had been central to Harappan's spirituality, may have intensified as communities sought spiritual solutions to environmental problems that were beyond their technological capacity to solve. The abandonment of settlements followed predictable patterns as environmental degradation progressed. Smaller agricultural villages were typically abandoned first as their inhabitants migrated to larger centers that still had functioning infrastructure. These larger settlements experienced temporary population booms as they absorbed refugees, but eventually faced their own resource limitations and began experiencing emigration as conditions deteriorated. Archaeological evidence from abandoned settlements reveals the gradual nature of this decline. Houses were not destroyed by warfare or natural disasters, but simply left empty as their inhabitants departed for more promising locations. Valuable items were typically removed, but everyday pottery, tools, and furnishings were often left behind, suggesting that people hoped to return when conditions improved. The directions of population movement during this period can be traced through pottery styles and architectural techniques that spread from abandoned Sarasvati basin settlements to regions that remained habitable. Many refugees moved eastward toward the Ganges Valley, where rivers continued to flow and agricultural conditions remained favorable. Others migrated southward into Gujarat and the Deccan, where different environmental conditions supported continued settlement. Some populations may have moved northward into the foothills of the Himalayas, where highland agriculture and pastoralism offered alternatives to the river valley, farming that was no longer sustainable in their traditional territories. Archaeological evidence for these movements remains limited, but genetic studies of modern populations suggest that Harappan-era migrations contributed to the demographic patterns found across the subcontinent today. The late Harappan cultures that emerged from this period of decline represent adaptations to environmental and social conditions that were fundamentally different from those that had supported the mature civilization. The cemetery H culture, named after burial practices discovered at Harappa, shows continuity with earlier traditions, but also significant innovations that reflect changed circumstances. Cemetery H pottery shows distinctive styles that combine Harappan motifs with new decorative elements that may reflect cultural mixing with populations from other regions. Burial practices shift from the simple inhumation that had characterized earlier periods to more elaborate ceremonies that may have reflected increased concern with death and ancestral spirits during times of social stress. The Jukar culture, identified in settlements in Sindh, represents another regional adaptation that maintained some Harappan traditions while incorporating innovations that reflected local environmental conditions. Jukar pottery shows influences from Central Asian cultures, suggesting increased contact with nomadic populations as settled agricultural communities became less stable. These successor cultures maintained some of the technological achievements that had characterized the mature Harappan civilization, particularly in metallurgy and craft production. Bronze working techniques continued to be practiced, though often with less sophisticated alloy compositions and finishing techniques. Pottery production maintained high-quality standards, though with reduced standardization and increased regional variation. Trade networks persisted on a reduced scale, with local and regional exchange continuing even as the long-distance commerce that had connected the Harappan world to distant markets declined. Evidence from this period shows continued production of beads, textiles, and metal goods, though in smaller quantities and with less uniform quality than had characterized the peak of the civilization. The question of violence during the decline period has been extensively debated by scholars examining the archaeological evidence. Early interpretations suggested that the civilization had been destroyed by warfare, possibly involving invasions by Indo-Aryan populations moving into the subcontinent from Central Asia. More recent analysis has found little convincing evidence for large-scale warfare or sudden conquest. Some skeletal remains from late-period contexts show evidence of traumatic injuries that could indicate violence, but these are relatively rare and could equally well result from accidents, criminal activity, or small-scale conflicts over resources during times of environmental stress. The absence of weapons, caches, fortifications, or burned settlements suggests that warfare was not a major factor in the civilization's decline. The Indo-Aryan migration, which brought new populations and cultures into the subcontinent during the second millennium before Christ, appears to have been a gradual process rather than a violent invasion. Archaeological evidence suggests that Indo-Aryan groups established settlements in regions that were already experiencing population decline due to environmental factors, rather than displacing thriving Harappan communities through conquest. Genetic evidence from modern populations supports this interpretation, showing that the demographic changes associated with Indo-Aryan migration involved gradual mixing rather than wholesale population replacement. The cultural changes that mark the transition from Harappan to post-Harappan cultures appear to result from this population mixing combined with adaptations to changed environmental conditions rather than from violent conquest. The linguistic evidence for this transition remains controversial because the Harappan script remains undeciphered. Vedic Sanskrit, the earliest form of Indo-European language documented in the subcontinent, contains loanwords that may derive from Harappan languages, suggesting cultural contact and mixing rather than complete replacement of earlier populations by incoming groups. Some place names in Vedic literature may preserve memories of Harappan settlements or geographic features, though the identification of specific correspondences remains speculative without decipherment of the Harappan script. The Rig Veda contains references to ruined cities and dried rivers that some scholars interpret as possible memories of Harappan decline, though this interpretation is disputed. Environmental factors continued to play the dominant role in shaping settlement patterns and cultural development throughout the post-Harappan period. The eastward shift of river systems that had begun the decline of the Sarasvati-based settlements continued, eventually establishing the Ganges as the primary river system of the northern plains. This shift drew population and cultural development toward regions that would become central to later Indian civilization. The techniques for managing water resources that had been developed during the Harappan period provided the foundation for agricultural systems that supported later civilizations in the subcontinent. Irrigation methods, well construction techniques, and water storage systems pioneered by Harappan engineers were adapted and improved by subsequent cultures, enabling continued agricultural development despite environmental challenges. Urban planning principles established during the Harappan period influenced later settlement patterns throughout the subcontinent. The grid pattern street layouts, standardized construction techniques, and integrated drainage systems that had characterized Harappan cities provided models that were adapted by later urban developers in different environmental and cultural contexts. The crafts traditions that had achieved such sophistication during the mature Harappan period continued to evolve during the decline, maintaining technological knowledge that would contribute to later developments in metallurgy, textile production, and decorative arts. The quality control systems and standardization techniques that had enabled mass production of trade goods provided precedents for later commercial and manufacturing developments. By 13 centuries before Christ, the transformation was complete. The great cities lay abandoned, their streets filled with wind-blown sand and their drainage systems clogged with debris. The Sarasvati had become a seasonal stream, then a chain of isolated pools, and finally, a dry channel remembered only in religious texts that called it the hidden river that flowed underground. The survivors of this environmental catastrophe had dispersed across the subcontinent, carrying with them fragments of the knowledge, techniques, and cultural traditions that had once supported the world's largest urban civilization. They would contribute to the development of new cultures, adapted to different environmental conditions, but the specific combination of factors that had made the Harappan achievement possible, the great rivers, the stable climate, the peaceful cooperation, would never be replicated. The decline of the Harappan civilization represents one of history's clearest examples of how environmental change can overwhelm even the most sophisticated human adaptations. Despite technological achievements that would not be matched for millennia, despite social organization that avoided the conflicts that destroyed other ancient civilizations, despite urban planning that created living standards rivaling those of the modern world, the Harappan people could not survive the loss of the river system that had made their way of life possible. The lessons of this collapse extend far beyond ancient history. In an era when human activities are changing global climate patterns and environmental systems that have remained stable throughout recorded history, the Harappan experience offers both inspiration and warning. It demonstrates that sophisticated, peaceful, and sustainable civilizations are possible, but also that they remain vulnerable to environmental changes beyond human control or adaptation. For 3,000 years, the greatest urban experiment in human history lay forgotten beneath the dust of time. The cities that had housed millions, the drainage systems that had rivaled Rome, the peaceful civilization that had stretched across a subcontinent, all of it vanished from human memory as completely as if it had never existed. Not a single line in the Vedas mentioned the great cities. The Ramayana and Mahabharata epics that preserved memories of ancient kingdoms and forgotten wars, contained no reference to Harappa or Mohenjo-daro, the civilization that had achieved what no other ancient society had managed: peace, prosperity, and equality on a continental scale, disappeared so thoroughly that when its cities were finally rediscovered, the shock would transform our understanding of human civilization itself. The forgetting was so complete that when British railway engineers began laying track across the Punjab in the 1850s, they had no idea they were systematically destroying one of archaeology's greatest treasures. The East India Company's railway expansion required massive quantities of ballast to stabilize the tracks across the soft, alluvial soils of the river plains. Local contractors, eager to supply the seemingly inexhaustible demand, had found perfect sources of pre-cut, standardized bricks scattered across the countryside in mysterious mounds that dotted the landscape. John and William Brunton, the Scottish engineers supervising the railway construction, thought they had struck gold. Here were millions of perfectly uniform bricks, already fired to ideal hardness, requiring only transportation to the rail line. The fact that these bricks followed precise mathematical ratios, 4 to 2 to 1 in length, width, and height, seemed merely a fortunate coincidence that made them ideal for construction purposes. The brothers had no way of knowing that they were dismantling cities that had been abandoned before the Trojan War, using 4,000-year-old urban infrastructure to build the modern transport network of British India. For decades, millions of Harappan bricks disappeared into railway foundations stretching from Karachi to Delhi. Entire neighborhoods of Harappa itself were quarried away, their ancient streets and drainage systems ground up and spread beneath the tracks of the Lahore-Multan railway line. The irony was profound. The most sophisticated urban planning of the ancient world was being destroyed to build the infrastructure of the modern world, and no one involved had the slightest idea what was being lost. The first hint that these mysterious brick mounds might represent something more than convenient building material came from Alexander Cunningham, the British Army officer who became the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India. In 1872, Cunningham visited Harappa and immediately recognized that the site represented something extraordinary. The bricks were too uniform, too precisely manufactured, and too extensively distributed to represent ordinary construction. The pottery fragments scattered across the surface showed decorative techniques and artistic sophistication that suggested a major ancient civilization. But Cunningham's initial reports generated little interest among British authorities, focused on more obviously impressive monuments like the Taj Mahal and the cave temples of Ajanta. The idea that the dusty plains of the Punjab and Sindh might contain ruins rivaling those of Egypt or Mesopotamia seemed absurd to Victorian sensibilities that viewed India primarily as a source of raw materials and agricultural products, rather than as the birthplace of sophisticated ancient civilizations. The breakthrough that would change everything came 50 years later, when Sir John Marshall took over as Director General of the Archaeological Survey in 1902. Marshall brought systematic archaeological methods to Indian excavation for the first time, training local teams in proper excavation techniques and establishing protocols for documenting and preserving discoveries. Unlike his predecessors, who had focused primarily on Buddhist and Hindu monuments from historical periods, Marshall was interested in prehistory, the deep past that lay beneath the documented civilizations of classical India. In 1920, Marshall dispatched 2 of his most trusted assistants to investigate reports of ancient ruins that had been generating increasingly intriguing artifact discoveries. Daya Ram Sahni was sent to Harappa, while Rakal Das Banerjee travelled to a site in Sindh called Mohenjo-daro, Mound of the Dead in the local language. Neither expedition expected to find anything more than interesting regional cultures that might fill gaps in the archaeological record of early India. What they uncovered, instead, would shock the archaeological world and fundamentally transform our understanding of ancient civilization. Sahni's excavations at Harappa revealed not just another ancient settlement, but a vast urban complex built according to sophisticated planning principles. Streets laid out in perfect grids, houses connected to elaborate drainage systems, public buildings constructed with unprecedented precision. This was urban architecture that rivaled anything from the classical world. But it was Banerjee's discoveries at Mohenjo-daro that truly stunned the international community. Beneath the innocuous-looking mound, his team uncovered what appeared to be a perfectly preserved ancient city. Not the gradual accumulation of successive settlements that characterized most archaeological sites, but a single, planned urban center that had been abandoned intact. The Great Bath, with its perfectly fitted bricks and sophisticated water management systems, looked like it could have been built yesterday. The residential areas showed uniform construction techniques and standardized layouts that suggested central planning on a scale not seen again until the modern era. When Marshall announced the discoveries in 1924, the response was immediate and dramatic. The London Illustrated News published detailed photographs and diagrams that showed urban planning sophistication that challenged everything archaeologists thought they knew about ancient civilization. Here were cities with running water, sewage systems, and standardized construction that predated similar developments in Europe by thousands of years. The implications were staggering. The discovery forced archaeologists to completely reconsider their assumptions about the development of human civilization. Previously, Mesopotamia and Egypt had been considered the earliest centers of urban development, with all other civilizations viewed as derived from these primary sources. The Harappan cities proved that sophisticated urban civilization had developed independently in the Indian subcontinent at the same time as, or perhaps even earlier than, the great cities of Sumer and the Nile Valley. More disturbing to colonial sensibilities was the evidence that these ancient Indian cities had been more advanced in many ways than their contemporary civilizations elsewhere. The sewage systems were more sophisticated than anything found in ancient Mesopotamia. The urban planning was more systematic than early Egyptian cities. The evidence for peaceful, egalitarian society challenged prevailing assumptions about the necessity of authoritarian rule for maintaining complex civilizations. The script discovery added another layer of mystery that continues to fascinate researchers nearly a century later. The thousands of inscribed seals, pottery fragments, and metal tablets covered with undeciphered symbols represented one of the world's great linguistic puzzles. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform, which had been successfully decoded through bilingual inscriptions and linguistic analysis, the Harappan script remained stubbornly indecipherable. Early attempts to decode the script focused on connecting it to known language families. Some scholars argued for links to Dravidian languages still spoken in South India. Others proposed connections to Indo-European languages brought by later Aryan migrations. Still others suggested that the script might represent a language isolate, a unique linguistic tradition that had no surviving relatives. But none of these approaches produced convincing translations that could be verified through archaeological or historical evidence. The script's brevity compounded the decipherment challenge. Most inscriptions contained only 4 or 5 symbols, far too short to reveal grammatical structures or provide the repetitive context that had enabled decipherment of other ancient scripts. The longest known inscription contains only 26 symbols, and even this may represent multiple short inscriptions rather than a single extended text. Without longer texts, traditional linguistic analysis remained nearly impossible. But the most puzzling aspect of the script was its structure. Computer analysis in the 1970s revealed statistical patterns that suggested the symbols functioned more like a logosyllabic system than a phonetic alphabet. The distribution of symbols, their frequency patterns, and their positional preferences resembled mathematical notation or symbolic logic more than conventional writing. Some symbols appeared almost exclusively at the beginning of inscriptions, others only at the end, while certain combinations repeated across thousands of seals with mechanical regularity. This discovery led to revolutionary theories about the nature of Harappan information management. Rather than phonetic writing that recorded spoken language, the symbols might represent a sophisticated notation system that conveyed meaning directly through visual metaphors and logical structures. Think of it as an ancient equivalent of modern computer programming languages, systems that communicate complex information through standardized symbols without necessarily representing the sounds of spoken words. The implications of this theory were staggering. If the Harappans had developed symbol systems that functioned more like mathematics than language, it would explain how they coordinated activities across millions of people without the bureaucratic apparatus that characterized other ancient civilizations. Instead of armies of scribes recording administrative details in written archives, they might have used visual symbols and oral traditions that could convey essential information more efficiently than phonetic writing. Modern artificial intelligence has brought new tools to the decipherment challenge, but with results that have only deepened the mystery. Machine learning algorithms trained on known ancient scripts consistently identify the Harappan symbols as representing a genuine communication system, rather than random decoration or simple identification marks. But the same algorithms fail to find linguistic structures that would enable translation using conventional decipherment methods. The most sophisticated AI analysis, conducted by researchers at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, has revealed that Harappan inscriptions show entropy patterns consistent with natural language but with structural characteristics unlike any known writing system. The symbols appear to encode information through positional relationships and combinatorial logic rather than through direct sound symbol correspondences. This suggests that the Harappans may have invented an entirely different approach to information storage and transmission, one that we're only beginning to understand. The political dimensions of Harappan archaeology became unavoidably complex when the 1947 partition of India divided the civilization's archaeological sites between two newly independent nations. Pakistan inherited Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and many of the largest and most important sites, while India gained control of Dholavira, Kalibangan, and sites in Gujarat and Rajasthan. This division created practical and political challenges that continue to complicate research today. Archaeological cooperation between India and Pakistan has been hampered by the broader political tensions between the two countries. Joint research projects have been rare, and scholars from each country have often found it difficult to access sites located across the border. This has led to somewhat different research traditions and interpretative approaches, with Pakistani archaeologists focusing more on the Western sites and their connections to Central Asian and Middle Eastern cultures, while Indian researchers have emphasized the Eastern sites and their relationships to later Indian civilizations. The division has also affected public understanding and cultural appropriation of the Harappan legacy. Both countries have claimed the civilization as part of their national heritage, leading to competing narratives about its significance and meaning. Pakistani textbooks emphasize the civilization's role as the foundation of South Asian culture, while Indian interpretations often stress its connections to later Hindu traditions and Sanskrit literature. These political considerations have sometimes influenced archaeological interpretation and funding priorities. Recent decades have brought archaeological breakthroughs that have revolutionized our understanding of Harappan civilization and revealed the full scope of discoveries still to be made. The excavation of Dholavira in Gujarat, led by R.S. Bisht in the 1990s, uncovered water management systems of unprecedented sophistication. The site contained 16 reservoirs carved directly into rock, connected by channels and dams that could capture and store seasonal rainfall for year-round use. The engineering required to create these systems demonstrated hydraulic knowledge that wouldn't be matched in the region for another 1,000 years. Even more remarkable was the discovery that Dholavira's water systems included sophisticated filtration and purification mechanisms. Settling tanks removed sediment from incoming water, while gravel beds filtered out impurities before storage in the main reservoirs. Overflow channels prevented flooding, while ensuring that excess water was directed to agricultural areas rather than simply lost to evaporation. The entire system was designed to function automatically, requiring minimal maintenance while maximizing water conservation in one of the subcontinent's most arid regions. The revelation of Rakhigarhi's true size has provided perhaps the most dramatic recent discovery. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have revealed that the site covers over 350 hectares, making it larger than Mohenjo-Daro and possibly the largest urban center of the ancient world. The implications are staggering. If Rakhigarhi housed populations proportional to its area, it may have contained over 100,000 residents at its peak, a megacity by ancient standards. Excavations at Rakhigarhi have also provided crucial insights into Harappan origins and development. The site shows continuous occupation from the earliest pre-Harappan periods through the mature phase, revealing how small agricultural villages gradually evolved into massive urban centers. The sequence of development provides a clear picture of how technological innovations, social organization, and population growth combined to create the urban revolution that characterized the mature civilization. Most significantly, Rakhigarhi has yielded ancient DNA that has revolutionized our understanding of Harappan population genetics and cultural continuity. Analysis of skeletal remains from the site reveals that the Harappan population was genetically continuous with earlier populations in the region, contradicting theories that the civilization was created by migrants from Central Asia or the Middle East. Instead, the evidence suggests that the Harappans were indigenous to the subcontinent, representing the culmination of local cultural and technological development rather than foreign conquest or colonization. The genetic evidence also provides crucial insights into what happened to the Harappan population after the civilization's decline. Rather than disappearing or being replaced by invading populations, the Harappan people appear to have dispersed across the subcontinent, mixing with other populations and contributing to the genetic diversity of modern South Asian populations. This finding contradicts earlier theories about Aryan invasions, replacing indigenous populations, and supports models of gradual cultural transformation rather than violent conquest. Satellite technology has emerged as one of the most powerful tools for Harappan archaeology, revealing the true scope of the civilization and enabling discoveries that would be impossible through traditional excavation methods. High-resolution imagery from commercial satellites has identified hundreds of previously unknown sites across the former extent of the civilization. Many of these sites are located in areas that are now inaccessible due to political boundaries, military restrictions, or urban development. But satellite analysis can still reveal their structure and significance. The most dramatic satellite discoveries have come from mapping the ancient course of the Sarasvati River system. Multiple space agencies, including NASA and the Indian Space Research Organization, have used different imaging techniques to trace the buried channels of the dried river across hundreds of kilometers. The resulting maps reveal a waterway system of staggering size, larger than the modern Ganges and Indus combined, that supported the largest concentration of Harappan settlements. Thermal imagery has been particularly valuable for identifying buried archaeological features. Ancient brick structures retain and release heat differently than surrounding soil, creating temperature signatures that can be detected from space even when the structures are buried under meters of sediment. This technique has revealed the outlines of entire cities, complete with street patterns, building foundations, and water management systems, without requiring any excavation. Ground-penetrating radar and other geophysical survey techniques have complemented satellite imagery by providing detailed subsurface maps of known sites. These techniques can reveal building layouts, identify promising areas for excavation, and assess the preservation state of buried remains before committing to expensive and time-consuming excavation projects. At sites like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, geophysical surveys have revealed that the excavated areas represent only small fractions of the total urban complexes. Digital archaeology has transformed how Harappan sites are documented, analyzed, and preserved for future research. Three-dimensional scanning and photogrammetry now create detailed digital models of excavated structures that preserve exact measurements and spatial relationships. These digital models enable virtual reconstructions that help researchers understand how ancient buildings functioned and how they related to surrounding urban infrastructure. The Harappan Archaeological Research Project, a collaboration between Pakistani, American, and British institutions, has pioneered the use of digital techniques for site documentation and analysis. The project has created comprehensive databases that integrate information from multiple sites, enabling comparative analysis that would be impossible when data remains scattered across different institutions and publications. This collaborative approach has revealed patterns of urban development, craft production, and cultural change that couldn't be detected through analysis of individual sites. Virtual reality reconstructions of Harappan cities now allow researchers and the public to experience these ancient urban environments in ways that would be impossible through traditional archaeological presentation. Walking through a virtual reconstruction of Mohenjo-Daro's streets, visitors can appreciate the sophisticated urban planning while understanding how the drainage systems, public buildings, and residential areas functioned as integrated systems. These immersive experiences help convey the remarkable achievements of Harappan urban planners in ways that static displays cannot match. Underwater archaeology has added another dimension to Harappan research, particularly along the Gujarat coast, where sea level changes since ancient times have submerged coastal settlements. The National Institute of Oceanography has identified several underwater sites that may represent Harappan-era ports and trading settlements. While underwater excavation in these areas remains challenging, sonar mapping and remote sensing have revealed structural remains that suggest significant coastal settlements that were inundated by rising sea levels after the civilization's decline. The most intriguing underwater discoveries have come from areas near modern Dwarka, where sonar surveys have identified what appear to be planned urban settlements beneath several meters of water. While the dating and cultural affiliation of these sites remain uncertain, they demonstrate that significant archaeological remains may be preserved in offshore areas that haven't been systematically explored. Future underwater archaeology may reveal crucial evidence about Harappan maritime activities and coastal settlement patterns. Conservation challenges facing Harappan sites have become increasingly urgent as urban development, agricultural intensification, and climate change threaten the remaining archaeological record. Many sites identified through satellite imagery are being destroyed by modern construction before they can be properly excavated and documented. The expansion of cities like Lahore and Ahmedabad has engulfed ancient sites, while agricultural mechanization has damaged surface remains across thousands of hectares. Climate change poses particularly serious threats to sites in arid regions where wind erosion is accelerating due to changing precipitation patterns and increased temperature extremes. Sites like Dolavira face challenges from both drought conditions that destabilize ancient structures and occasional extreme rainfall events that cause flooding and erosion. Sea level rise threatens coastal sites, while changing river courses affect sites located near modern waterways. International cooperation has become essential for addressing these conservation challenges effectively. UNESCO has provided technical assistance and funding for conservation efforts at major sites like Mohenjo-Daro, while bilateral agreements between Pakistan and India have enabled some collaborative research projects despite broader political tensions. Private foundations and international development agencies have also contributed funding for site conservation and research infrastructure. The establishment of site museums and visitor centers has helped raise public awareness about the importance of Harappan archaeology while generating revenue that can support conservation efforts. The Harappa Museum in Pakistan and the Archaeological Museum at Lothal in India provide excellent examples of how archaeological sites can be presented to the public in ways that both educate visitors and promote conservation awareness. Modern genetic studies have provided revolutionary insights into Harappan population dynamics and cultural continuity that complement and sometimes challenge archaeological interpretations. Ancient DNA extraction from skeletal remains at sites like Rakhigarhi has revealed population genetic structures that persist in modern South Asian populations, suggesting greater continuity between ancient and modern populations than previously recognized. The genetic evidence has been particularly important for understanding the relationship between Harappan populations and later cultural developments in the subcontinent. Rather than showing evidence for massive population replacement associated with Indo-Aryan migrations, the genetic data suggests complex processes of cultural exchange and gradual population mixing that preserved significant elements of earlier demographic patterns. These findings have implications that extend far beyond academic archaeology. They provide scientific evidence that challenges simplistic narratives about ancient invasions and population replacements that have sometimes been used to support modern political and cultural claims. The evidence for population continuity supports models of cultural development that emphasize local innovation and gradual change, rather than external conquest and replacement. Isotope analysis of human and animal remains has provided additional insights into Harappan mobility patterns, diet, and trade relationships. Strontium isotope ratios in tooth enamel can reveal where individuals spent their childhood, enabling researchers to track population movements and identify migrants within Harappan communities. These studies have revealed surprising levels of long-distance mobility, with individuals born in distant regions settling in major urban centers. Carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis of bone collagen has revealed details about Harappan diet and agricultural practices that complement archaeological evidence from plant and animal remains. The isotope data confirms that Harappan diet was based primarily on wheat and barley cultivation, with significant contributions from dairy products, consistent with archaeological evidence for cattle domestication and management. What the Harappan civilization offers to modern society goes far beyond historical curiosity or archaeological fascination. In an era when humanity faces unprecedented challenges related to urban sustainability, environmental management, and social inequality, the Harappan example provides both inspiration and practical lessons that remain remarkably relevant. The Harappan approach to urban planning offers crucial insights for modern, sustainable city development. Their integration of water management, waste disposal, and residential planning created urban environments that supported dense populations without environmental degradation. The standardization that enabled efficient resource distribution while maintaining architectural diversity provides models for how modern cities might balance efficiency with livability. Their water management techniques, particularly the sophisticated systems developed at sites like Dolavira, demonstrate approaches to water conservation and distribution that remain applicable in arid regions today. The integration of rainwater harvesting, groundwater management, and waste treatment that characterized Harappan cities offers proven solutions for modern water scarcity challenges. Perhaps most importantly, the Harappan civilization demonstrates that large-scale social organization doesn't require oppressive hierarchy or violent coercion. For 7 centuries, millions of people across vast distances cooperated in economic and social systems that provided unprecedented prosperity and quality of life. They achieved this through standardization, specialization, and trade relationships that created mutual benefits rather than exploitation. The absence of warfare in Harappan society challenges modern assumptions about the inevitability of conflict in complex societies. Their example suggests that peaceful cooperation might be more effective for achieving prosperity and stability than competitive approaches that characterize much of modern international relations. While the specific conditions that enabled Harappan peace may not be directly replicable, their example expands our understanding of what human societies might achieve. The Harappan emphasis on collective welfare over individual aggrandizement provides an alternative model for economic organization that contrasts sharply with systems that prioritize wealth accumulation by elite individuals or groups. Their achievement of relatively egalitarian prosperity demonstrates that economic growth and social equality can be compatible rather than contradictory goals. Their sophisticated craft production and quality control systems demonstrate approaches to manufacturing and commerce that balanced efficiency with sustainability. The Harappan example shows how standardization and mass production can coexist with environmental conservation and resource sustainability, lessons that remain crucial for addressing modern challenges related to consumption and environmental degradation. The environmental factors that ultimately led to Harappan decline also provide crucial lessons for modern societies facing climate change and environmental degradation. The Harappan response to environmental stress, attempting to maintain traditional practices through technological solutions rather than fundamental adaptation, offers warnings about the limitations of purely technological approaches to environmental challenges. Their ultimate inability to adapt to the loss of the Sarasvati river system demonstrates how even sophisticated civilizations can be vulnerable to environmental changes beyond their control. This lesson has particular relevance for modern societies that depend on environmental stability for agricultural productivity, water resources, and economic prosperity. But the Harappan legacy also demonstrates human adaptability and resilience. The populations that survived the civilization's decline dispersed across the subcontinent, contributing their knowledge, techniques, and cultural traditions to the development of subsequent civilizations. Their innovations in agriculture, metallurgy, urban planning, and craft production provided foundations that supported later cultural achievements throughout South Asian history. The preservation and study of Harappan sites represents more than academic interest. It provides essential information about human possibilities and potential that remains relevant for addressing contemporary challenges. Their example expands our understanding of how human societies can organize themselves, manage resources, and create conditions for widespread prosperity and peace. As we face an uncertain future marked by environmental change, technological disruption, and social inequality, the Harappan civilization offers both hope and practical guidance. They proved that human societies can achieve remarkable things through cooperation, planning, and commitment to collective welfare. Their legacy reminds us that the challenges we face today are not insurmountable, and that human ingenuity and cooperation can create solutions that benefit everyone rather than just privileged elites. The ongoing rediscovery of Harappan civilization through new archaeological techniques, technological innovations, and international cooperation demonstrates that we're still only beginning to understand what they achieved and how they achieved it. Each new discovery adds to our appreciation of their remarkable accomplishments, while providing additional lessons that remain relevant for creating better human societies. The greatest tribute we can pay to the Harappan achievement is not simply to admire their accomplishments, but to learn from their example. In their combination of technological sophistication with social cooperation, environmental management with economic prosperity, and individual welfare with collective responsibility, they created a model of human civilization that remains worth pursuing. Their legacy challenges us to imagine and create societies that achieve the peace, prosperity, and sustainability that they demonstrated was possible.